Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Star Wars Lads. This week we are going to be doing another tier list for you. We are going to be talking about everything from the High Republic Phase 1. This was voted by all of you on our latest poll for our tier list for September this month. If you didn't know, we always put up 5 topics for all of you to pick from for the latest tier list for the month. This time it was chosen to be the High Republic Phase 1 rankings. We are going to be talking about all the books and the comics in here. We will post the runner-up as well as some other new options next month for it. Actually, that is not true because next month we're going to be doing some type of like villainous horror theme. So we'll probably have some newer tiers. But the following month in November, we'll be doing these runner-ups and all of that again for all of you to choose whichever choice you want us to talk about. So keep an eye on that community tab and check out all the rest of our polls. So if you haven't yet, please also like this video and subscribe to our channel. We're on the road to 1,000 subs, and it will really help us out if all of you who are watching this are subscribed to our channel and have given us a like. It'll help us get into that YouTube algorithm, interact with more Star Wars fans so we can continue to grow our community and have more debate on these tier lists. That's one of the things we love is reading all of your comments down below. So please comment below and let us know what your favorite parts of the High Republic Phase 1 were. High Republic Phase 2 is coming fast and furious. It's almost here. We're a couple weeks away, and I can't believe it. Like, it feels like this just ended. And I guess with the amount of Star Wars books we've had recently that haven't been High Republic, it's definitely kept us entertained as we get to Phase 2. So let's bring in the tier list here. And we've got all of the stuff from Phase 1 down below. We didn't include like each arc of the comics. We just included the series as a whole since they were short enough and pretty much all flow into each other. And then we've got all of the novels as well as the audio drama and the manga. So let's get into our first thing, which is Light of the Jedi. Sanak, what are your thoughts on Light of the Jedi?
It was great. It was truly showcasing the Jedi at the height of their powers, at their most joyful, beautiful, just before the impending disaster, the great disaster of the book, and seeing how it all played out. I always forget just how detailed Soul's writing is, but just how engaging it is at the same time. It doesn't ever come off as too much. And all of our characters that we really care about throughout Phase 1 are really introduced here, other than a couple other stars in other books and formats. It's a great book. Honestly, it's S tier for High Republic. It's you could have asked for a better start.
Completely agree. S tier. It's my favorite book in the High Republic, so I definitely want it up at that top. What a wonderful introduction, like you said. It shows the Jedi at their most awe-inspiring, and I really love the Great Disaster section at the beginning, the way it's able to layer in all these different types of Jedi and all the different aspects of the way they battle and the way they fight and the way they come to people's rescue. It's just wonderful. And also the part that really puts this book above all the other ones for me is its initial origins for Marchion Ro, the way it introduces him as our new villain, the way it creates the Nihil as this like insane, crazy force that we have to reckon with. See a Jedi fighting something they've never had to face, which is like complete and utter chaos. And Marchion Ro is such a conniving, manipulative, great villain. Absolutely love it. Definitely S tier.
Our next book of the High Republic Initiative and our first middle grade book by Justina Ireland, A Test of Courage. Liam, what are your thoughts on this book?
I think it's up there amongst junior novels, really, in both canon and legends. And it's one of the reasons why we ranked Justina Ireland pretty highly on our tier list. I think she does a phenomenal job writing this story, and these characters are quite good. Vernestra Rowe and Emery Cantaros are definitely amongst the best junior novel characters we've seen in a while. There's a lot of depth given to them, and it's a story that really takes pride in its characters, which is something junior novels don't necessarily always do. A lot of times they're more focused on telling an interesting story for younger readers, but it introduces two pretty important characters, especially for Vernestra Rowe as this young Jedi Knight. It's a really good, solid start to the junior novel series in the High Republic. I would probably put it B tier just because I think other things are higher than it, but it is very, very good amongst junior novels.
I think it blew me away with just how good it was for a junior novel middle grade book. This was rich, this was exciting, this was fun. the four main characters really make this story. I mean, Ernesto Rowe is one of the highlights of the whole phase one of Light of the Jedi with so much potential. Imri Kantaros, Ava Staros, Honesty Ren was also another great character. I thought the treatment of the Nile, treatment of these four characters, the development for them, all were really great. I'd be willing to push for an A, honestly. I could say it dropped down to a B, but I think it could be an A.
I would be willing to bump it up to an A because I think it is easily the best of all these junior novels. That'll have us move on to our next book, which is Into the Dark by Claudia Gray. This was our first young adult book. Sanak, what were your thoughts on Into the Dark?
This is a pretty underrated book, in my opinion. It definitely plays heavily into the idea of the Drengir being almost an equal sort of villain, opposite to the Nile, at least in this book, because I don't think they're ever anywhere near as lethal or scary or imposing or filled with the horror biological sense that they kind of carry with them. Has, some of my favorite characters like Comac Vitus, Reed Silas. I like a lot of the flashback stuff. It's mysterious. I really do like just the fact that the mystery carries the story. Reed is a bookworm Jedi. He feels like an Obi-Wan in my mind that just is a lot more devoted to books, but he has all the same skills and traits as like a young Obi-Wan did. So I really appreciate that. I love the Jedi dynamics. I love the mistakes that were made by these characters in this book and how they try to fix them and how some of their decisions are also affected by their past with their trauma and everything. It's an A for me.
I think as a novel as a whole, I would also give it an A. I think it's one of the better novels. It's my favorite of the young adult novels for sure. And I think when I'm looking at the rest of the list, I think it probably is my third favorite overall of the novels in this series. So I think A is a solid spot for it.
The next one, which is the High Republic comic written by Cavan Scott. Yeah, Liam, what are your thoughts?
I think the Marvel High Republic line is actually very good. And it has times when it gets, bogged down in the fact that we're waiting in between novels, not able to push the story forward. But I think Avar Kriss was one of the characters I really liked from Light of the Jedi, and I was happy that this series continues her exploits further into the Initiative, where she was kind of sidelined in the rest of the novels. And that was one of the more disappointing things about the Initiative overall to me. But I thought this did a really solid job with it. I think there are elements of this that, like I said, get bogged down, but they don't reach for as grand a things as you can with comics. Like sometimes with comics, you can go further than you can go in novels, and you can kind of just explore those more ridiculous and like expansive parts of Star Wars. I think they could have done that a bit more. The Drengir felt right as the villains for this. I felt like after the Drengir were gone, the series struggled to find its voice for a little bit, and then it picked up towards the end as we started connecting with Fallen Star. Probably give this a B.
I think a B is a pretty good grade for this, and I agree. It's a story that is great for what it does, but it doesn't really take those risks. It doesn't really use its medium as fully as it could have. It feels like a continuation for a lot of things, which, makes sense. But then we have characters, like you said, Avar, who's a star of Light of the Jedi, and her story is pretty well developed here. She's like a secondary protagonist. She's not even really the main one. Keeve Trennis is still the biggest one. Sometimes Skier is bigger than Avar. Avar starts to kind of take over more towards the end. A lot of the stuff that needs to be set into place before Fallen Star with her character has to be shown. The Dragon threat was handled really well here, and I thought this was probably the best medium to finish it in. I just wish that the ending with Avar being such a prominent character was also re-explored in the Fallen Star in text to kind of parallel it to give a little bit more depth over in text form. But instead, this is the only way we know anything about her character before and during the events of Fallen Star. So I think B is pretty fair as well.
Okay, so our next series to talk about is another comic book series. It is the High Republic Adventures. So what were your thoughts on this series?
Yoda is the big selling point for entering into the series. It's once Yoda leaves in the story, that's where it could have completely fallen apart, but it actually really took some really big steps. It's definitely helps that the series is really well intertwined with a lot of the junior novels too, which made me feel very encouraged to read the series. I love being able to explore this whole band of characters. Like Lula Telesola is probably still the most bland, and she is our main character. It's once we move from Lula to these other characters that are Padawans under Yoda, like Court, new pickup of Zine, Farfalla. We get all these interesting dynamics. It's nice seeing these characters who are young kids be put into some pretty serious situations. They're also quite tied in with Markion Rowe with some of the stuff with the Nameless, kind of like the staff and all the equipment necessarily to control them. Some of it, at least part of it, originates here, which was being a completionist have some very serious payoff, actually. It's nice seeing some more mid-tier, lower-tier Nile infighting and politicking and battles. I have to give it a B, and it kind of ends with an issue that's just like oh no, what'll happen in the Fallen Star, which was disappointing for me because it always kind of stood really strongly on its own, and then it just didn't. So B for me.
I will also say B. It's tough when comparing it to the other High Republic book, which I think tells more interesting, more expansive stories. But I actually did end up falling in love with these characters a lot more. First 5 issues of this series, I was kind of dreading the future because it's your typical very, very safe type of Star Wars kids storytelling, and it's not like it's bad per se. It's just it was nothing interesting, and I was definitely not looking forward to it. But around issue 6, it started going further, incorporating a little bit more of the rest of the High Republic initiative. I remember Leox, Jossie, and Geode were in, I believe, 6 or 7. They go on a little adventure with Farfalla and Court, and that's when the series started picking up for me. I started getting more attached to the characters at large. I'm not. Where would you rank it? Would you rank it above High Republic? I think because the character work, I might, but the stories are far more interesting in the High Republic series.
I honestly would give it over the High Republic. Not to say the High Republic
Yeah.
is bad by any means, but it blew us away how fun of a ride High Republic Adventures became.
Yeah, I think it was a surprising book, and for sure that's the reason it's above, even with one more lackluster arc at the beginning.
All right, so then let's move on to another novel, The Rising Storm, the next big book, the next adult novel that starts off Wave 2, written by Cavan Scott. Liam, your thoughts?
The Rising Storm is an excellent book. It's very narrowly my second favorite piece of High Republic material, right after Light of the Jedi. I think it's because a lot of times I'm more interested in the way things are all started rather than continuation. Like I give a little bit more credence to laying the foundations of the world rather than the next step. But this, in traditional Star Wars sense, is a darker, bigger, grander, more exciting sequel. It really steps up almost on every level in terms of its action and its pace. One of the best paced Star Wars books I've read in a very long time. And it introduces some good to great characters while continuing further our characters that we liked in the first one. The absence of Avar Kriss was a little disappointing for me, but replacing her, we got Stellan Gios, who I also really fell in love with. The introduction of Ty Yorick here was really strong. I think she's a really interesting supporting character I'd like to see return. Bel Zettifar, further stuff with him and dealing with the disappearance of Loden, all of that worked quite well. And the Elzar Mann stuff and getting to see how Elzar plays off of Avar in the first book and then gets to play off of Stellan here. Elzar's really our through line character through the loose trilogy, if you want to call it that, of the High Republic adult novels. And I thought all of the work here is really great. Definitely an S tier.
While you love beginnings, I always love seeing the next step. Like, what do you do to separate yourself from just being another repeat or rehash? It's something where The Empire Strikes Back succeeds, or something The Last Jedi mostly succeeds. It's something where Attack of the Clones kind of succeeds for me. And it's always a second book or movie or comic that really makes it for me, more so than the first one. Because the first one, like you said, it is groundwork. It can be joyous. It can just be about the excitement and thrill of entering this new universe and this new story. But what do you do with them afterward? That's always harder to repeat that same success. And then Cavan just came in, blew my mind. I think the battle here is just so incredible, so detailed. I love how intertwined it is with Race to Crashpoint Tower. That I really love this story. I love the continuations. So yeah, S tier for sure.
All right, then I will drop it in S tier. I wish we could put them like overlapping right on top of each other because they
It's
are
like a
so close.
1A, 1B. It's a 1A,
Absolutely.
1B for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's barely anything that separates the two. It's just like the slight things that show or where your personal taste really accentuates which one you like more. So the next book we have is Race to Crashpoint Tower. You just mentioned it. It was written by Daniel Jose Older. It's our second junior novel. What were your thoughts on this one? You kind of alluded to him already.
Yeah, I mean, it's really well intertwined with The Rising Storm. It lets us kind of play around with Ty Yorick a little bit too. We get Ram or Ram. I don't know how people pronounce it. It's tomato to me, but Ram Jamorum, Ram Jamorum, he's in here. He's a very fun, tinkering sort of Jedi. Very nerdy, very geeky, very fun. And then we get to see like characters like Lula Talisoa, who gets to interact with Ernesto Rowe. Connection between the High Republic Adventures and the 2 books of the junior novel series of the High Republic in Phase 1. So that was all really cool to see. I'm a sucker for intertwining stories, and when it's done really well, this is like probably the pinnacle of the whole Phase 1 for me. And That being said, the story itself is it's fine. It's just more Nile side characters doing stuff, trying to bring that Drengir conflict and being directly involved, which was curious to me. But they become Saturday morning cartoon versions pretty quickly here. They feel like they still have some threat and weight in the High Republic line of Marvel. They're very scary and into the dark, but here they're just funny. Like there's literally them scampering into a ship and flying off at the end of this book, which was weird to me. I guess it did bring Ramjo more into the High Republic Adventure comics, which I love. He really fit into the group really well. But I honestly have to give this one a C tier.
I would also say C. I think you hit on two things that I wanted to touch on. First, it's skippable. It's a plot that doesn't really have much impact on the rest of the initiative besides the introduction of Ram, which kind of re-happens in High Republic Adventures anyways. So if you hadn't read this, doesn't necessarily put you in a poor position, which the rest of this material either focuses on characters that aren't anywhere else or need to be known for other things, like A Test of Courage. You need to know for Nestero if you're going to read Out of the Shadows, or some of the other materials she's referenced a lot. This one doesn't really feature much that's not at least retold in other material. The second thing, too, is just the plot. This is one of the most forgettable plots, I think, in all the High Republic stuff. It's very small scale and like it is tied in. So that is something nice that you can read it as a little companion piece for a separate perspective on some of the big events in the Rising Storm. But for me, it's just very simple. And it's one of the only High Republic things that I feel like doesn't take that extra step to really try to do something important or special. It just kind of is there to fill a publishing release void. It doesn't feel like it's much unique on its own.
Our next young adult book, which is Out of the Shadows by Justina Ireland, who wrote the junior novel Test of Courage. So this was a change of, what are your thoughts on this book?
Out of the Shadows is the one novel I would say that I just wasn't a huge fan of throughout this entire initiative. And I wouldn't say it's bad. It's just a significant step down to me, especially when comparing to the other young adult and adult novels. It's hard to compare this to junior novels because any type of young adult or adult novel, just by pure page numbers alone, is going to be far more in depth and far more interesting in terms of the way it carries itself. But I think with Out of the Shadows, it felt overlong. It also felt like it told stories about characters that ultimately didn't seem to be very important in the long grand scheme of things. The Yarrow family really didn't play as big of an impact as I had hoped, except for Chansey, who ends up becoming a big part of the Fallen Star. But again, she's kind of just around and integral to the plot, but you don't necessarily need to know who she is prior. I thought the way especially Wreath was handled in this book wasn't necessarily that exciting to me because he does take a big step back and he's kind of presented as our main character for the young adult books, but then drops off, in Out of the Shadows, and then brings back a little bit more to prominence in Midnight Horizon, but is still also more of a complementary character there than the absolute lead. But I thought here there was a chance to really give us a strong epilogue to the Rising Storm, which had such a big, powerful, impactful ending. And for me, it was a little too slow, a little meandered with some of its characters that I think it could have done a bit more with. And ultimately, it didn't really connect to anything else in the whole initiative. I think for me, this would be a D tier.
Again, I don't think it's bad. It's just, if you look at a review for this book, we struggled at some point to just get through some of the glacial pacing, especially once they're on Coruscant. I really did struggle with also Silvestri, and usually Star Wars in the High Republic especially has done its diversity really well by bringing in characters who are non-binary and all that and letting them be unique individuals. I don't know, when I read anything with Silvestri, it just made me think about Affy Hollow, right? And I was like, okay, so what's the difference between Silvestri and Affy? I honestly couldn't tell much, and I feel bad because I think Silvestri could have been a character that got developed, and Affy kind of gets to still develop past her book. We don't really have anything with Silvestri, and I don't know if I didn't want to know anything more about her. Her story's done. Silvestri just felt carbon copied, and that really frustrated me. And she had some banterous moments, but I wasn't really engaged. And when we talked about this in our initial review, I did mention it felt like all the space station stuff and all the stuff with Chancey Yarrow, that stuff felt like it was supposed to be more prominent. I felt like almost like a cut storyline that just has some consequences that all the other books and audio dramas and everything play off of, but we don't know anything about it. So I don't know. I feel like there was something that was supposed to happen after this book that was going to be covered in another book or be its own separate release, but it's just not there. They're ultimately is very little payoff to this story other than bringing characters over to Fallen Star. So it's a D tier for me.
Well, we agree there, but we're definitely looking forward to Path of Deceit when Justina Ireland drops her next young adult book, because everybody's saying that's wonderful. So can't wait for that. Now to get into Tempest Runner, which is our only audio drama we're talking about with the High Republic Initiative. What were your thoughts on Tempest Runner?
I think it doesn't necessarily advance our Tempest Runner to any level of like growth. It's more of like a break down her character, bring her back up, and make her double down on everything that she is. And Lorna D is a character that, she's just like an angry Twi'lek, right? But here we get to like really see breakdown of her character, how she's interacted with Jedi, how she's been mistreated by so many people, why she became part of the Nihil, how much of it was her own doing, how much of it was timing, just how much she was shaped and affected by it. But there was a point there, and for a good chunk of the story, where I was like, I felt genuinely bad for her, even though she was literally trying to like destroy Starlight Beacon like at the start of the story. But then, it brings us back to the end ending that it's like, okay, she's back, better than ever. There's consequences to it that we don't really see explored or explained in other books. It just feels like it has another leap. And when we reach Wave 3, nowhere near as bad as Out of the Shadows, but because of that, I want to say it's only a B.
I will also say B. I think it's a story that, similar to Race to Crashpoint Tower, isn't necessarily necessary, but opposite of Race to Crashpoint Tower, where it's a more surface level story that doesn't necessarily have too much character depth or really any deep dive into anything in particular. Tempest Runner does give us a nice character examination of Lorna D, if nothing else. So while it isn't a story that's necessarily important if you're trying to, let's say, start the High Republic right now and binge all the way through, this isn't one that you absolutely have to read. But I think it does give some nice context for a villain, and it does work in terms of its character stuff. It also gives us the conclusion of the Pan Ada character, which I remember really enjoying from Light of the Jedi and the Rising Storm. It just kind of disappears if you haven't read this. He's in this as well. It's good. It's good. It's not my favorite audio drama. It's not even my favorite audio drama from Kevin Scott, but I do think it is worthwhile and worth your time. B tier.
Our first and only graphic novel, which was then changed into a miniseries through IDW, The Monster of Temple Peak by none other than Kevin Scott. What are your thoughts on this miniseries graphic novel?
For me, it felt like something that would have worked much better as a singular volume rather than as 4 issues that came across a month. And I think some of that might color the way I grade this for sure, because I think by the time we reached the last couple issues, it became both a little slow, but also the certain storylines like the flashbacks of Ty were just wrapped up very quickly, and I wanted a bit more from that because I found that the most interesting, way more interesting than the actual stuff on Temple Peak. That being said, I thought the art was great, the coloring was great. They used more digital coloring, which I think looked pretty good in this. It was a series that was interesting to read, but it's not something, it's again something that's relatively skippable, especially because Ty never really shows back up in anything else, so, at least so far, probably not till phase 3. I'd probably give this a C. I think it was a decent story, but nothing too special.
It was not great. It is a prequel. When I think of a graphic novel, I was expecting a little bit more intense line work and drama and action to it. And it's more of flashbacks. It's more of like her character just trying to move forward. But then we see her real development, which actually happens in The Rising Storm with her connection to Elzar. Here, it's just like there's not too much you can do. What's the so-called monster of Temple Peak? It is literally just a monster. But then it's brought in by all the villagers, and it's like, whoa, what a twist. We never saw that coming. And I don't really love the rabbit-like creature that follows her. Her backstory is sufficiently tragic, but I don't know. I didn't care too much. I felt like the book in The Rising Storm already got what we needed from her. Yeah, I say D, honestly.
Okay, I'm fine with that. It's very barely C. I think it is by far the weakest comic we've gotten, and I think it's right on that bubble. So let's move on to The Edge of Balance. What were your thoughts on The Edge of Balance? We put both of them on the list, but we're just going to rank them all as one part of the series.
This is a story that it's fine, right? It's more cool to see everything in manga and like Man, the artwork is so good. It really is. It carries through the story. Maybe it's if it's because it's in black and white, or maybe the artistry is just a different level. But I felt like the landscapes and everything felt so much more bigger and expansive on Banshee, especially. So it was really cool. I don't think Lily's a great character. She's just kind of like Asian girl with like katana style dual wielding. Yeah, the Banshins are cute and adorable. I love them. It's like just another perspective of what we see in the Great Disaster in the Nile. And that's the Drengir could mutate a bit depending on the planet, but that doesn't really change much about their story. The second issue is kind of sad because her apprentice dies, and Master Artok is just off doing something else. And then we also get the character from the High Republic Adventures on Takodana. That Jedi Master also shows up in the second, and they were already badass in the High Republic Adventures. Here they get to look even more so. The story needed more than 2 volumes for me. It needed to be 3 minimum. Felt like they had a story, and nothing to bridge it. And the fact that it kept on getting delayed and spread out definitely made it harder to like be excited for it. I'll give it a C.
C for me as well. I think that last point is something I was really going to hit on. It's the fact that volume 1 was delayed so long, and then it was kind of like the advents of the Rising Storm, and really phase 1 wave 2 had been happened so far before this that we were so in so many other places. Like the Drangir weren't really a thing in the rest of the initiative, but we were still dealing with it at Edge of Balance. Just always felt behind, and I think that definitely hampered my enjoyment of it. Like you said, art's fantastic, writing's pretty good, characters could be a little better, more fleshed out. I think we needed a bit more story here. Love the design of Lily and her katana sabers. I think it's very cool, and it's a nice touch. The story is a bit lacking. I think they work better read back to back if you read the two volumes together. That being said, I think still C. It's definitely one of the more forgettable parts of the High Republic so far.
Well, something that totally captured our imagination was Trail of Shadows by Daniel Jose Older. What are your thoughts on this, Liam?
Trail of Shadows is an interesting one, especially because it is so different than anything Daniel Jose Older has done in Star Wars, but not just Star Wars, like in High Republic specifically. With the High Republic Adventures and Midnight Horizon, even Race to Crashpoint Tower, all his work usually has a bit more of a comedic undertone. It's about kids, it's about early teenagers. They're cracking jokes, they're having fun. This is not that at all. There's a horror thriller vibe to this. There's tragic nature to this story, and I really enjoyed it. Very torn where to put this because I loved issues 1 through 3. I thought they were fantastic, especially the first 2 issues. I thought it just nailed the tone. It was working so well, and I think with the fallback of the Fallen Star, the way everything started to get delayed to try to catch up to it, the way everything tied in so tightly to it, it ultimately lost a little bit of its uniqueness in that way. And I think for me, that's where it started to, or it didn't end as well as I'd hoped. This is one that I definitely want to get the trade paperback and reread all the way through, have all 5 issues just consecutively, because we waited, 5 or 6 months for this entire thing to finally roll out. And I think by then it lost some steam. I'm torn between A and B. I don't think it's as high quality as Into the Dark or A Test of Courage, so I don't know if I could put it at A. Definitely top of B, but those first 3 issues are definitely amongst my favorite comics I've read in the High Republic.
I will push for an A for this. It's a pretty weak A, especially now that we've had quite a bit of time since we read it. Because man, like you said, those first 2 issues were blown away. The third one's also great. It's the fourth and fifth that are just purely tie-ins, delays to Fallen Star, and it stops being as unique. It has such a huge impact. We get to really see the Nameless and the effect on the Jedi in this series. It's very noirish and creepy, and the vibes of that I feel like the books try to get at, but something about the visual format and seeing like the jittery letters really helped. Emmerich and Shan are such a great duo. They really captured my attention. No nonsense Jedi with like a suave, kind of cultured private eye detective, and Shan. It was really cool. I love that dynamic. And there's like genuine care between them. Emmerich can't really open up as a Jedi, and she helps him to do so, which I thought was really cool. We get to see some cool things from the end of or during the events of Fallen Star 2, which I don't think hurts, even if it takes away from what this story is. This investigation was always going to kind of crash into the Fallen Star. I just wish it maybe did that in the final issue instead of the last 2 issues, and then I could have been fine with that. But because of that, it's a bottom of it. At one point, it really had the makings of being one of the best Star Wars comic miniseries in canon for sure.
Looking at the rest of the competition, I think bottom of A is good enough. So now we have the initial onset of Phase 1, Wave 3. We have the Fallen Star, everything tied into this. What were your thoughts on the Fallen Star?
For me, The Fallen Star is definitely the weakest of the adult trilogy, and it's not a bad book at all. I'd still give it like an A minus, B plus, like if I had to give it a letter grade. And it's only because Claudia Gray has such a huge reputation, and we already saw her do really well in The High Republic 2 of just delivering banger books. But this is a story that I felt like you needed to bring every single main POV character and at least give them a chapter or two. For me, I really struggled with having Avar be in the story, but only have like sentences instead of having like at least half a chapter for a perspective. Like as a bit of a big spoiler for this story on the Fallen Star, even though it is about Starlight Beacon, it talks about what's happening for the majority of it on, I believe, the bottom half of the station. Avar and her crew are on the top half. I believe the High Republic Adventures Jedi are in the top half. And that's fine. It's just we don't hear anything about them. Avar, we get word about how she's been replaced, and we see that in the High Republic series. But then she's on the planet, she survives, and we don't get her POV or any perspective. We get in the comic, which is fine. I don't mind that. It's just I wanted the big three of characters, Stellan, Elzar, Avar, to have POVs here. It's mostly Elzar, some Stellan. You just give, even if you had to make Avar the smallest one here, at least give her two POVs, especially at the crucial points, and they just weren't there. And also the scope of the story, it's not as expansive or rich as the first two because it's all on the station. So it's more of like a ticking clock because we know everything's going to go wrong from the first minute. And it's claustrophobic at times. They took out chunks of the story that I understand being adapted in those other mediums, but give me a paragraph of what Midnight Horizon was about. Give me 2 chapters of Avar POVs, and this book would have been excellent. This would have been the best trilogy of Star Wars canon books for sure. It's because it's not there that you're like it's still great for what it does, but it doesn't reach the exact same highs of the first two. And I'm tempted to almost drop this down to A. I don't know. I think I'd leave this one up to you because I'm fine with it being top of A.
Yeah, I was gonna say B tier for me, honestly. I think it's a tonally and what Claudia Gray is going for here with the tone and the feel and the mood. She nails all of it. All the character deaths, all the impactful things that happen in this, they all work. But it is the one that's absolutely most reliant on the rest of the initiative to fill in its holes. And it skips things and makes you confused why it's, just all of a sudden a character is gone and they don't ever show back up. Well, that's picked up in issue 15 of the High Republic comic book, or this character is mentioned, but they come on a comm or something, and now they're gone forever. Where are they? This book doesn't tell you. I felt like there's a lot of things that just hamper the enjoyment of reading this. It's an exciting book. It works for its tone and its feel and its storytelling, but I think for me there was always something missing. There was always something left out. So I guess we'd split the middle and let's go A.
The final of our junior novel books in the High Republic Phase 1, Wave 3, is Mission to Disaster, bringing Justina Ireland back from the young adult adventure that she took in Out of the Shadows and bringing her back to the medium that she dominated with Test of Courage, with Mission to Disaster. What did you think of this book, Leo?
Mission to Disaster, I definitely like more than Race to Crashpoint Tower. I don't think it's quite as good as A Test of Courage in its character moments. That being said, because it's a junior novel, I'm debating whether to put it at the bottom of B or top of C. I think it's a story that's relatively forgettable, but again, like A Test of Courage, it does have those characters moments with Vernestra and Emery that make this book stand out. And it's nice as a sequel to A Test of Courage, and I think that's where some of our bigger criticisms is when you take certain characters out of their medium and then you plug them into other things, but you don't really do anything with them. I think Justina Ireland has a nice little duology here between A Test of Courage and Mission to Disaster, even though probably can't read them back to back and really know what's happening because you need some of the other material. But the characters do progress here more so than they do in Out of the Shadows. It's really like these characters belong in this medium, and it works quite well. I'd be happy with either bottom of B.
I think I could give it a bottom B. There's some hints that apparently will affect Phase 2 when we go back in time, when we have Honesty back as a character, so that was nice to have gang kind of sort of reunited. The ending was also quite good because there's a kidnapping of this poor little Sana Star Wars, but she finds out like, hey, I didn't tell my mom anyone's names. How does she know all this? Which, if you read this right before Fallen Star, you would have been like, oh my god, the Senator is involved at the Nile with Markion Ro. Like, it would have been a great lead. And obviously, we kind of read this later, so it was like, obviously it makes sense. sense that she's acting up and all this stuff. It's not as rich as Tested Coverage, but I think its scope is more comparable to Race to Crashpoint Tower. And Race to Crashpoint Tower did some cool things with Lula and Vernestra while they're kind of building off of that first arc of High Republic Adventures, figuring out some of the amulets and connections for the Nameless. So it had a little bit of that scope here. But it's still not, it's not as good at what it's trying to do as a Tested Coverage was. So I'd give it a spot of a B.
Next, we have Midnight Horizon by Daniel Jose Older, our final young adult novel. What were your thoughts on this one?
I like this one a lot. It was a very quick read, even if ultimately there's not really much that you need to know. It's nice as payoff for some of the stuff that happens in the High Republic Adventures with Zine, especially. Ram Jamorum gets to be developed here too, and I love his dynamic with Reed. That's really cool. Comac is just in here, and then he leaves at the end, which are just like, what? The Corellia stuff is great because I love seeing what Solo Star Wars Story did and seeing that kind of be returned here aesthetically and be developed in text. But as far as like its importance to Fallen Star, not really. Just explains why and what the other Nihil are doing, why the rest of the galaxy isn't responding. It's fine. I'd give it a B.
I'm in agreement. I think B, probably towards the top of B. I think it's a really well-written novel, and it does have a lot of payoff if you've been reading High Republic Adventures. I think we said in our review, and I've heard slowly over time from people who've read it and haven't read High Republic Adventures. It is confusing if you haven't, because it's mostly all High Republic Adventure characters minus Wreath. So I guess if you've read Into the Dark, you might get a little bit out of it, but still, it's heavily populated with High Republic Adventures, and even major moments that are built up to in High Republic Adventures are resolved in this novel rather than in the comic. And I think that was something we kind of talked about as being disappointed with the ending of High Republic Adventures, but also it's just weird. It's weird in the nature of an initiative. Still, I think it's a really well-written novel. It's definitely the funniest novel out of all of these. It makes you laugh, and there's a lot of entertainment factor here, for sure, B.
We will rank the final two comics, the Eye of the Storm comics, as one, written by Charles Soule. What did you think of the Eye of the Storm?
The Eye of the Storm was something I thought was definitely set up to fail. The way they released it in 2 oversized issues, that type of release has not worked for Star Wars really in the entirety of canon. There haven't been too many one-shots or even mini anthology series or something that I've enjoyed that much. I thought this was excellent. Easily my favorite comic book in the High Republic Initiative. And it just lays so many important pieces. And Charles Soule, I think, was the person who wrote Marchion Road the best. Might not have some of his coolest exploits. I think Rising Storm gives some of his cooler, more like badass moments. But I think Charles Soule got into Marchion Row the best in Light of the Jedi, and he continues it here. This really is a Charles Soule character, and I can't wait to see what is done with this character further. I love learning about his history and his past, his people's past, why they do what they do, formation of the Nile. All that type of stuff is really fascinating, and I love that it goes beyond really where we're at with the Fallen Star. It starts to connect all of the pieces. It was a great epilogue, definitely the last thing you should read, or part 2 is the last thing you should read when you read the entire initiative. I'd actually give this S tier. I think it's wonderful.
I was going to say the same thing. I think it is an S tier. It felt like it was promising a lot. Like, oh, this is going to explain everything about Marchion before and after. And you're like, oh, okay, sure. Like, I guess. But then it did. And it did it really visually in a pretty dynamic way. It didn't overstay or become exposition dumps as much as I thought it would be. Like, it said it's what it had to say, but then it let the visuals kind of speak for themselves. It's nice seeing a little bit more about Marchion's people, and I want to see how and what role they play in Phase 2, because there's a lot of hints towards that and what they were doing before the events of the Nile's creation even. So I'm very curious to see what his species does. And the second issue is still, to this day, I think essential reading with Fallen Star, because it serves as the epilogue. It explains what happens. He uses like these things called like something storms. Like they're like little tiny spiky balls that prevent ships from going to hyperspace, kind of being all trapped in. And he corridors the entire outer rim for himself, which is shocking because he's already caused such a symbolic defeat. And then he has the white picket fence that you can't get over, which I thought was sensational, very symbolic. On top of that, like what he owns and what he can destroy, and how everything is now up to him, that he truly is the ruler. Just he's fencing himself in, and you never know what's going to happen because you can't see over the fence. You can't come into the fence. And I thought that was really cool. Yeah, S tier all the way. It's so good.
That it is. Well, thank you all for watching our tier list of the High Republic rankings. Let us know down below how you would rank all this material. We know we have a lot of High Republic fans out there. We really enjoyed following this entire initiative with all of you. And we're glad that all of you chose this as our tier list for the month. If you haven't yet, please hit that like button down below and subscribe to our channel for continued Star Wars content. It'll really help us out with the YouTube algorithm. And we're on our road to 1,000 subscribers. And you'll want to be a part of the ground floor of Star Wars Lads as we continue to march towards that milestone. Comment below, let us know. Thank you all so much for watching. We'll see you next time.